They say some miracles arrive wrapped in chains, waiting for the one person brave enough to set them free. On a bitter October morning in Montana, when the frost clung to everything like a warning, a ranch worker named Dylan Cross discovered something that would prove how profoundly one act of compassion can reshape not just a single life, but an entire community's understanding of what healing really means. Dylan was 38 years old and had spent the better part of 3 years trying to outrun a past he couldn't quite shake. He worked at the Whitmore Ranch, a spread of land that had seen better decades, where the fences leaned tired and the grass grew thin. It wasn't glamorous work, but for a man who'd lost more than he cared to remember, it was enough. The elderly owner, Benjamin Whitmore, had taken a chance on him when nobody else would, offering him employment and a small cabin in exchange for fixing what was broken and keeping what remained standing. Dylan's mornings always started the same way. Coffee before dawn, then walking the fence lines that separated the ranch property from the wild forestland beyond. It was solitary work, the kind that let a man think too much or not at all, depending on his mood. He carried his grandfather's toolbox, the metal worn smooth from decades of use, and stopped every few hundred yards to repair whatever time and weather had damaged. The sound reached him before he saw anything. It was low at first, almost like wind moving through trees, but there was something distinctly alive about it. Something suffering. Dylan froze mid-step, listening hard. The sound came again, clearer now, the labored, desperate breathing of something large and in terrible pain. He followed the noise deeper into the trees, his boots crushing through fallen leaves. The breathing grew louder, accompanied now by the metallic clink of chain against wood. Dylan's pulse quickened as he pushed through dense brush and stepped into a small clearing dominated by an oak tree so ancient it seemed to belong to another century entirely. What he found there would stay burned into his memory forever. Collapsed at the base of that massive oak was a horse unlike any Dylan had ever seen. The animal was enormous, easily 18 hands or more, with a coat so black it seemed to swallow the pale morning light. But it was the chains that made Dylan's stomach drop. Heavy industrial chains wrapped around the horse's neck and body, securing him to the tree like some prisoner from a darker age. The metal had cut deep, leaving raw wounds that spoke of desperate, futile attempts to break free. The horse's breathing was shallow and ragged. His ribs jutted sharply beneath that black coat. One massive hoof scraped weakly at the frozen ground in what looked like a final, fading attempt at survival. Then Dylan noticed the piece of paper tied to the chain around the horse's neck. With hands that wouldn't stop shaking, he untied the note and unfolded it. The handwriting was rushed, almost illegible. His name is Goliath. I can't feed him anymore. He's too big, too wild, too much trouble. Maybe someone else can save him. I'm sorry. No signature. Just water stains on the paper, rain or tears, Dylan couldn't tell which. He looked down at the dying giant at his feet. Goliath's eyes were the color of deep amber, and when they met Dylan's gaze, something passed between them that felt almost like a question. Are you here to help, or just to watch me die? Dylan had never owned a horse in his life. He could barely afford to feed himself, let alone an animal that probably ate more in a day than Dylan did in a week. The practical thing would be to call the authorities and let them handle it. Animal control would come out, assess the situation, and likely decide that euthanasia was the kindest option. But kneeling there beside Goliath's massive head, looking into those intelligent, amber eyes, Dylan heard himself whisper words that surprised even him. I'm getting you out of here. I don't know how yet, but you're not dying alone in these woods. The horse's ear flickered toward him. Dylan could have sworn he saw the faintest spark of hope kindle in those eyes. He examined the chains more carefully. Old but strong, secured with a heavy padlock that would need serious tools to break. The chains were wrapped in multiple layers, creating a web of metal that would be impossible for even a horse this size to slip free from. Dylan ran back to his cabin and returned carrying every tool he owned: bolt cutters, wire cutters, a hacksaw, an old pry bar from the barn. The work was excruciating and slow. Several times he had to stop when Goliath tried to struggle, terrified the animal would hurt himself worse. But gradually, link by link, he began to free the giant horse from his metal prison. As he worked, Dylan found himself talking to Goliath in a low, steady voice. He told the horse about the ranch, about the pasture where he could run, about the hay and the barn and the clear stream that cut through the eastern property. He wasn't sure if Goliath understood the words, but the horse seemed to calm at the sound of his voice, breathing more steadily as the chains fell away. When the last chain hit the ground with a heavy clang, Goliath didn't immediately try to stand. He lay still, as if he couldn't quite believe he was truly free. Dylan sat back on his heels, sweat on his forehead despite the cold, and watched as Goliath slowly began to test his newfound freedom. The horse's first attempt to rise failed. His weakened legs couldn't support his massive frame. But on the second try, with a grunt that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest, Goliath heaved himself upright. He swayed, finding his balance, then stood perfectly still with his head raised high, nostrils flaring as he tested the wind for the first time without metal choking his neck. Dylan expected Goliath to bolt. Most horses would have run the moment they were free, especially after being chained for God knows how long. Instead, Goliath turned that magnificent head toward him and took one careful step in his direction. Then another. And another. Until he stood close enough that Dylan could feel the warmth radiating from his massive body. Very slowly, Dylan raised his hand toward Goliath's muzzle. The horse didn't flinch or pull away. Instead, he lowered his great head and allowed Dylan to stroke the velvet-soft nose, those amber eyes never leaving Dylan's face. In that moment, something profound passed between man and horse. An understanding. A bond. A mutual recognition of two souls who had both known abandonment and were ready to trust again. "Come on, Goliath," Dylan said softly. "Let's go home." The walk back to the ranch should have been simple, less than half a mile through fairly level terrain. But Goliath's condition was worse than Dylan had initially realized. The great horse could only manage a few dozen steps before needing to rest, his breathing becoming labored with even minimal effort. More than once, Dylan wondered if he was witnessing a noble animal's final journey rather than a rescue. But Goliath refused to give up. Every time he stumbled, he caught himself. Every time he had to stop, he would look at Dylan with those remarkable eyes and then push forward again. It took them nearly 2 hours to cover what should have been a 15-minute walk. When they finally emerged from the forest and Goliath saw the ranch spread out before him, something changed in the horse's posture. His head came up higher. His ears pricked forward. Dylan could have sworn he saw recognition in the animal's gaze, not of this specific place, but of what it represented. Safety. Food. A chance to heal. A chance to trust again. Getting Goliath settled required every bit of resourcefulness Dylan possessed. The old barn hadn't housed a horse in over a decade, and most of the stalls needed emergency repairs before they could safely contain an animal of Goliath's size. Dylan spent the rest of that first day patching holes, spreading fresh straw, and rigging up a temporary water system using garden hoses and plastic buckets. Goliath stood in the center of the barn aisle, watching Dylan work with patient intelligence. Occasionally he would wander over to investigate, his massive hooves making hollow sounds on the old wooden floor, but he never got in the way or showed any signs of the wildness his previous owner had complained about in that note. When Benjamin Whitmore returned from his weekly trip to town that evening, he stopped dead in his tracks at the sight of the enormous black horse standing peacefully in his barn. At 72, Benjamin had seen enough of life to know that surprises usually meant trouble. But when Dylan explained how he'd found Goliath chained in the forest, the old rancher's weathered face softened with genuine emotion. "Son," Benjamin said quietly, running a gnarled hand along Goliath's neck, "I've been around horses my whole life. And I can tell you something about this one. This isn't just any animal. This is the kind of horse that comes along once in a lifetime, if you're lucky." Dylan felt warmth spread through his chest at the old man's words. He'd been afraid Benjamin would be angry about the unexpected addition to their struggling operation, maybe even demand that Dylan find somewhere else for Goliath to go. Instead, the rancher was looking at the great horse with something approaching awe. "But Dylan," Benjamin continued, his voice taking on a more serious tone, "taking care of an animal like this isn't going to be cheap. He'll need special feed, veterinary care, probably extensive treatment to get him back to full health. Are you sure you're ready for that kind of responsibility?" Dylan looked at Goliath, who was standing with his head lowered, those amber eyes half closed in what looked like contentment. The horse's ribs still showed through his coat. The wounds on his neck were still raw and angry. Dylan had no idea how much it was going to cost to nurse him back to health. By any practical measure, keeping Goliath was probably the worst financial decision he could make. "I'm sure," Dylan said simply. And he meant it with every fiber of his being. The first week was touch and go. Dr. Patricia Vance, the local veterinarian, made emergency visits every other day to check Goliath's wounds and monitor his condition. She was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who had been treating ranch animals for over 2 decades, and she didn't sugarcoat the situation. "He's severely malnourished," she told Dylan after her first examination. "Those chain wounds are infected, and his digestive system is going to need time to adjust to regular feeding. You can't just throw hay at him and expect him to bounce back. This is going to be a long process, and there's no guarantee he'll make a full recovery." But Dr. Vance also saw something in Goliath that gave her hope. Despite his weakened condition, the horse's spirit remained unbroken. He submitted patiently to her examinations, allowed her to clean and dress his wounds without flinching, and showed none of the fear or aggression she typically saw in abused animals. "Most horses that have been through what he's been through would be nearly impossible to handle," she explained to Dylan as she wrapped fresh bandages around Goliath's neck. "But this one seems to understand we're trying to help him. That's unusual. And it's a very good sign." Dylan established a careful routine designed around Goliath's recovery. Early morning feedings of small portions of specially formulated grain, followed by gentle walks around the pasture to build up the horse's strength. Afternoon sessions where Dylan would groom Goliath's coat and clean his wounds, talking quietly the whole time about whatever came to mind. The weather, memories of his childhood, dreams for the future he'd stopped allowing himself to have. Goliath seemed to look forward to these sessions. He would nicker softly when he saw Dylan approaching with the grooming supplies. The great horse would stand perfectly still as Dylan worked the brush through his coat, his eyes half closed in what looked like pure contentment. Sometimes Dylan would catch himself telling Goliath things he'd never told another living soul. About his fears, his regrets, his hope that maybe this time he was doing something right. As the days passed, Goliath began to transform. The hollow places in his flanks started to fill out as his body adjusted to regular meals. The wounds on his neck healed cleanly, leaving scars that would always be visible but no longer caused him pain. Most remarkably, his coat began to develop a shine that made him look like a horse carved from polished obsidian. But the most dramatic change was in Goliath's behavior. The quiet, patient resignation that had characterized his first days at the ranch gradually gave way to something Dylan had never expected to see: playfulness. Goliath would trot over to the fence whenever Dylan appeared in the pasture, tossing his great head and nickering like an oversized puppy. He developed a habit of gently tugging at Dylan's jacket with his teeth, a game that never failed to make Dylan laugh. One morning in early November, Dylan arrived at the barn to find Goliath standing at the gate of his stall, pawing impatiently at the ground. When Dylan opened the gate, instead of walking calmly to his feed bin as he usually did, Goliath burst past him and cantered, across the pasture. His tail flagged high, his powerful legs eating up the ground with a grace that took Dylan's breath away. For the first time, Dylan was seeing Goliath as he was meant to be. Not as a victim or a rescue case, but as a magnificent creature in his prime. Powerful and proud and utterly alive. The sight brought tears to his eyes. He found himself laughing and crying at the same time as he watched the great horse run. Word about Goliath spread through the small community with the speed that news travels in places where everyone knows everyone. Before long, people started finding excuses to drive by the Whitmore Ranch just to catch a glimpse of the legendary horse. The stories grew with each telling, as stories do, but the core facts remained consistent. Dylan Cross had found a dying horse chained to a tree and somehow brought it back from the brink of death. Some visitors were simply curious, but others came with more complex motivations. Emma Rodriguez brought her 8-year-old daughter Lisa, who had been struggling with severe anxiety since her parents' divorce. Lisa was a quiet child who seemed to carry the weight of the world on her small shoulders. She spent most of her time staring at her shoes rather than engaging with the world around her. But something magical happened when Lisa saw Goliath. The great horse was grazing in the far pasture when they arrived, and at first Lisa hung back by the fence, intimidated by his sheer size. Goliath, however, seemed to sense her presence. He raised his magnificent head, studied her for a long moment, and then walked across the pasture with deliberate purpose. When Goliath reached the fence, he lowered his great head until it was level with Lisa's, separated only by the wooden rails. The child looked into those amber eyes, and something in her posture changed. Very slowly, she reached through the fence and touched Goliath's nose. The horse stood perfectly still, allowing the connection. Lisa whispered something too quiet for the adults to hear. From that day forward, Emma brought Lisa to visit Goliath every weekend. The little girl would bring carrots and apples from home, and she would spend hours talking to the great horse in a voice too low for anyone else to understand. But Dylan could see the change in her. The way she started walking with her head up. The way she began to smile again. The way she stopped flinching when adults spoke to her. "I don't know what you're doing," Emma told Dylan one Saturday afternoon as they watched Lisa brush Goliath's neck. "But whatever it is, it's bringing my daughter back to life." Goliath seemed to have that effect on everyone who met him. Marcus Williams, a local teenager who had been getting into trouble with drinking and petty crime, started showing up at the ranch after school. At first, Dylan was suspicious. Marcus had a reputation as a troublemaker, and Dylan worried he might try to hurt Goliath or cause problems. But Marcus surprised him by asking if there was any work he could do around the ranch in exchange for being allowed to spend time with the horse. Dylan put him to work mucking stalls and repairing fence, expecting the boy to lose interest after a day or two of manual labor. Instead, Marcus threw himself into the work with an intensity that amazed everyone who knew him. He would arrive every day after school and work until dark, never complaining about the hard physical labor or the smell of the barn. More importantly, Marcus began to change. The anger that had seemed to radiate from him started to fade, replaced by a quiet focus his teachers had never seen before. His grades improved. He stopped getting into fights. The local sheriff's department noticed that the minor vandalism and petty theft that had been plaguing the area suddenly decreased. One evening, Dylan found Marcus sitting in Goliath's stall, his back against the wall, the great horse's head resting gently in his lap. The boy was talking quietly, and Dylan caught fragments of what he was saying. Confessions about feeling lost. Admissions about being scared of the future. Promises to do better if he could just figure out how. Goliath listened with the patience of a priest taking confession, his amber eyes never leaving the boy's face. When Marcus finished talking, the horse nuzzled him gently. Dylan saw tears streaming down the teenager's cheeks. The transformation in the community was subtle but undeniable. People who had been feuding for years found themselves standing side by side at Goliath's fence, united in their awe of the magnificent animal. Children who had been afraid of horses begged their parents to bring them to meet Goliath. Adults who hadn't smiled in months found themselves grinning like fools as they watched the great horse play in his pasture. Dr. Vance noticed the change too. "I've been treating animals in this county for 20 years, she told Dylan during one of Goliath's routine checkups. "And I've never seen anything like this. It's like that horse of yours is some kind of therapy animal, except nobody trained him for it. It's just natural." Dylan was beginning to understand that Goliath was indeed something special. Something beyond his previous experience or understanding. The horse had an intuitive ability to sense what each person needed and provide exactly that. Whether it was patience for a frightened child, steady companionship for a troubled teenager, or simple acceptance for adults who felt lost and alone. But Goliath's most profound impact was on Dylan himself. For the first time in years, Dylan found himself looking forward to getting up in the morning. His days had structure and purpose beyond simple survival. The constant worry that had been his companion for so long began to ease as he watched Goliath grow stronger and more confident. The financial burden of caring for Goliath should have been crushing, but somehow it worked out. Benjamin quietly increased Dylan's wages, claiming it was payment for the additional work. Dr. Vance began charging reduced rates for Goliath's care, saying it was her contribution to the most interesting case of my career. Feed dealers offered discounts. Farriers worked for reduced fees. Somehow the money always seemed to be there when it was needed. More importantly, Dylan began to feel like he belonged somewhere again. The steady stream of visitors to see Goliath meant he was interacting with more people than he had in years. And to his surprise, he found himself enjoying the conversations. People would ask about Goliath's history, about his care and training. Dylan discovered he had knowledge and insights worth sharing. One particularly busy Saturday in December, as Dylan was explaining Goliath's exercise routine to a group of fascinated visitors, he caught sight of his reflection in the barn window. The man looking back at him was someone he barely recognized, upright, confident, animated, alive in a way he hadn't been for years. The transformation was as dramatic as Goliath's had been, and just as miraculous. If this story is touching your heart, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Sometimes the most powerful healing happens when we realize we're not alone in our struggles. That night, as Dylan was doing the evening chores, Goliath followed him around the barn like a gigantic dog, occasionally bumping him with his nose or playfully tugging at his jacket. Dylan found himself laughing at the horse's antics, and he realized with a start that laughter had become a regular part of his life again. "You know, boy," Dylan said as he filled Goliath's water trough, "I thought I was rescuing you that day in the forest. But I'm starting to think you might have been rescuing me." Goliath whinnied softly and pushed his great head against Dylan's shoulder. Dylan could have sworn the horse understood exactly what he meant. The real test of Goliath's transformation came in late December when a winter storm brought several inches of snow and temperatures dropped well below freezing. Dylan woke one morning to find that the automatic waterer in Goliath's stall had frozen solid, and the backup water buckets were covered with ice. As he worked to break up the ice and restore Goliath's water supply, Dylan heard voices coming from the direction of the main road. Through the barn's small windows, he could see a group of people approaching on foot. Apparently their car had gotten stuck in the snow somewhere up the road. As they got closer, Dylan could see it was a family, parents and 2 young children, all of them underdressed for the weather and clearly struggling with the cold. The father was carrying the smaller child. The mother was helping the older one through the snow drifts. Dylan met them at the barn door, already reaching for his truck keys to offer them a ride back to town. But before he could speak, Goliath appeared behind him, his massive head visible over Dylan's shoulder. The children's eyes went wide with wonder. Their distress seemed to evaporate instantly. "Is that really him?" the older child whispered. "Is that Goliath?" Dylan realized that Goliath's reputation had spread even beyond their county. These people had driven from hours away specifically to see the legendary horse, despite the threatening weather. The father explained that their daughter had been having nightmares since a car accident several months earlier, and they had heard that Goliath had a special ability to help children who were struggling. Dylan invited them into the barn to warm up. Almost immediately, Goliath worked his magic. The little girl, who had been clinging to her mother's hand and hadn't spoken above a whisper, approached the great horse with growing confidence. Goliath lowered himself to the ground, making himself less imposing, and allowed the child to sit beside him in the straw. For over an hour, the little girl talked to Goliath in the private language that children use with animals they trust. Dylan couldn't make out most of what she was saying, but he could see the tension leaving her small body as she stroked Goliath's neck and whispered her secrets into his attentive ear. When the family finally had to leave, the transformation in the child was remarkable. She was standing straight, smiling, chattering excitedly to her parents about everything Goliath had told her. Her mother had tears in her eyes as she shook Dylan's hand. "I don't know how to thank you. We've tried doctors, therapy, medication. Nothing has helped her like this. How do you explain something like this?" Dylan looked at Goliath, who was watching the family leave with those intelligent amber eyes, and shook his head. "I can't explain it. I just know it's real." As winter gave way to spring, Goliath's reputation continued to grow. The local newspaper ran a feature story about him. Before long, Dylan was fielding phone calls from as far away as California. People who had heard about Goliath and wanted to bring their children, their parents, their siblings, to meet him. Dylan found himself saying yes more often than he probably should have. Partly because he couldn't bear to turn away people who were clearly desperate for help. Partly because he was fascinated by Goliath's consistent ability to provide exactly what each person needed. The horse seemed to have an unlimited capacity for empathy, an intuitive understanding of human pain, a gift for offering comfort without judgment. A family from Denver brought their autistic son, who had never spoken a word in his 8 years of life. The boy spent 3 hours with Goliath. Just as they were preparing to leave, he looked directly at his parents and said, clear as a bell, "Goliath is my friend." An elderly man recovering from a stroke drove 6 hours with his daughter to meet Goliath. The horse stood patiently while the man struggled with his walker. When the gentleman finally reached the fence, Goliath gently rested his head on the man's shoulder. For the first time since his stroke, the man smiled. A young woman brought her combat veteran husband, who hadn't been able to sleep through the night since returning from overseas deployment. Goliath seemed to sense the man's hypervigilance and stayed close to the fence during their entire visit, his presence somehow conveying safety and peace. That night, for the first time in over a year, the veteran slept for 8 straight hours. Each story amazed Dylan. But what amazed him even more was the change in himself. He had become something he'd never expected to be, a caretaker not just of Goliath, but of all the hurting people who came to seek the horse's healing presence. He found himself learning to read body language, to sense when someone needed to talk and when they needed silence, to offer gentle encouragement without being pushy or overwhelming. Benjamin Whitmore watched these developments with growing admiration. "Son," he told Dylan one evening as they watched Goliath grazing in the sunset-painted pasture, "you've found your calling. This isn't just about taking care of one horse anymore. This is about something bigger." Dylan knew Benjamin was right. But the implications of that realization were both thrilling and terrifying. If he was going to do this properly, if he was going to create a real program that could help more people, he would need better facilities, trained staff, insurance, formal protocols. It would mean transforming from a ranch hand who happened to care for a special horse into something much more complicated and challenging. But as he watched Goliath lift his magnificent head and whinny a greeting to a car that was just pulling into the driveway, another family seeking hope and healing, Dylan realized he didn't really have a choice. Goliath had chosen him for this work. Walking away was no longer an option. The breakthrough came in May when Goliath did something Dylan would later describe as the most remarkable thing he'd ever witnessed. A family had driven from Montana's eastern plains, bringing their 12-year-old son, Kevin, who had been born with cerebral palsy and had never been able to walk without assistance. Kevin was a bright, articulate boy who had never let his physical limitations dim his enthusiasm for life. But Dylan could see the longing in his eyes as he watched other children run and play. Kevin's parents had brought him to meet Goliath more in hopes of giving him a special experience than with any expectation of physical improvement. Goliath seemed to sense something different about Kevin from the moment he saw him. Instead of his usual gentle approach, the great horse walked directly to the fence where Kevin sat in his wheelchair and began what Dylan could only describe as a conversation. Goliath would nicker softly. Kevin would respond. The horse would nicker again, as if they were exchanging information that none of the adults could understand. After about 20 minutes of this exchange, Goliath did something unprecedented. He walked to the gate of his pasture and stood there, looking expectantly at Dylan. When Dylan opened the gate, Goliath walked directly to Kevin's wheelchair, positioned himself parallel to it, and then lay down in the grass beside the boy. Kevin's parents started to protest, worried about their son's safety around such a large animal. But Kevin himself seemed to understand what Goliath was offering. With more determination than Dylan had ever seen from anyone, let alone a child with severe physical limitations, Kevin began the laborious process of transferring himself from his wheelchair onto Goliath's broad back. It took nearly 15 minutes, with Kevin's parents helping to steady him. But eventually the boy was sitting astride Goliath, his face glowing with pure joy. Goliath remained perfectly still throughout the entire process, as patient and steady as a mountain. And then Goliath stood up. Kevin's parents gasped. Dylan held his breath. Kevin himself let out a whoop of delight as he found himself 8 feet off the ground, sitting on the back of a horse that weighed over 1,000 pounds. Goliath began to walk slowly and carefully, carrying his precious cargo around the pasture with the precision of a trained therapy horse. For 20 minutes, Kevin experienced something he had never thought possible. The freedom of movement, the joy of speed, the exhilaration of being tall and powerful and unstoppable. His laughter filled the air. Dylan saw tears streaming down the faces of his parents. When Goliath finally returned to where Kevin's wheelchair waited and carefully lowered himself to allow the boy to dismount, Kevin threw his arms around the horse's neck and whispered, "Thank you, Goliath. Thank you for letting me fly." Dylan realized in that moment that what he'd been witnessing wasn't just animal intelligence or even animal empathy. It was something approaching wisdom. A deep intuitive understanding of what healing really meant and how it could be offered. That night, Dylan made a decision that would change the trajectory of his life. He called Benjamin Whitmore into the kitchen and laid out a proposal that was equal parts ambitious and terrifying. He wanted to establish a formal therapeutic program with Goliath as the cornerstone. He wanted to bring in additional horses, train volunteers, create a facility that could serve people from all over the region. Benjamin listened with growing excitement. When Dylan finished talking, the old rancher leaned back in his chair and grinned. "Son," he said, "I've been waiting my whole life for someone to come along with a vision like this. Let's make it happen." Within 6 months, the Goliath Recovery Ranch was officially established as a non-profit organization. Benjamin donated 40 acres of his land to the program. Donations began pouring in from people who had heard Goliath's story or had been touched by his healing presence. A local construction company volunteered to build proper facilities, complete with accessible pathways and specialized equipment for working with people with disabilities. Additional horses were carefully selected and trained to work alongside Goliath, though none of them ever quite matched his intuitive understanding of human need. Volunteers were recruited and trained. Therapy protocols were developed. Partnerships were established with hospitals, mental health centers, and veterans organizations throughout the region. But at the heart of it all remained Goliath. The magnificent black horse who had been found chained to a tree with a note claiming he was too wild and dangerous to be saved. Every morning, Dylan would find Goliath waiting at the gate of his pasture, ready for another day of healing work. His amber eyes bright with what could only be described as purpose. The program grew beyond anything Dylan had dared to imagine. Families traveled from across the country to participate in week-long intensive programs. Military veterans found solace in Goliath's patient presence. Children with autism, depression, anxiety, and physical disabilities discovered abilities they never knew they possessed. Adults dealing with grief, trauma, and loss found a path back to hope. Dylan kept careful records of the people Goliath worked with. The statistics were remarkable. Over 90% of participants reported significant improvement in their conditions after working with Goliath. Children spoke their first words. Trauma survivors slept through the night. People in wheelchairs found the confidence to attempt new forms of mobility. But numbers could never capture the real impact of what Goliath accomplished. Dylan saw it in the smile that spread across a grieving mother's face when Goliath gently nuzzled her hand. He felt it in the silence that fell over a group of troubled teenagers when Goliath entered their therapy session. He experienced it himself every single day in the profound satisfaction that came from knowing he was part of something larger than himself. Something that mattered in ways that could never be measured or quantified. 5 years after finding Goliath chained to that oak tree, Dylan stood in the main barn of the recovery ranch, watching as the great horse worked with a young girl who had been selectively mute since witnessing a violent crime. Goliath was lying in the straw beside her, his massive head resting in her lap, while she whispered secrets she had never been able to share with another living soul. Dr. Vance appeared beside Dylan, her veterinary bag in hand after completing Goliath's routine health check. At 63, she had officially retired but continued to donate her services to the ranch because, as she put it, "I've never seen anything like this, and I'm not about to miss out on being part of it." "His vital signs are perfect," she told Dylan. "Heart rate, blood pressure, muscle tone, everything indicates a horse in peak physical condition. But more than that, he seems to thrive on this work. Most horses would be exhausted by the emotional demands of what he does. But Goliath actually seems energized by it. Dylan nodded, still watching Goliath with the mute girl. It's like he was born for this. Like everything that happened to him, the abuse, the abandonment, being chained to that tree, was preparing him for this purpose. Dr. Vance was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "You know, Dylan, I think the same could be said about you." That evening, as Dylan completed his final rounds of the ranch, checking on the horses and securing the facilities for the night, he found Goliath waiting for him in their old ritual spot by the pasture gate. The great horse nickered softly when he saw Dylan approaching, and pushed his head against Dylan's shoulder in the gesture of affection that had become as familiar as breathing. Dylan wrapped his arms around Goliath's powerful neck and pressed his face against the warm, glossy coat. 5 years ago, he'd been a broken man with nowhere to go and nothing to offer. Tonight, he was the director of a thriving therapeutic program that had touched hundreds of lives, with a waiting list that stretched for months and expansion plans that would allow them to help even more people. The transformation still amazed him. Not just in himself, but in Goliath. The horse that someone had deemed too wild, too dangerous, had become the gentlest, most intuitive healer Dylan had ever encountered. The animal that had been abandoned to die had become a source of hope for people who had given up on finding help anywhere else. "Thank you," Dylan whispered into Goliath's mane, as he had done countless times over the years. "Thank you for saving me. Thank you for showing me what I was supposed to do with my life." Goliath blew softly through his nostrils, a sound Dylan had learned to interpret as contentment. Together they stood in the quiet darkness. Two souls who had found each other in the most unlikely circumstances and had built something beautiful from the wreckage of their past. As Dylan finally headed back to his cabin, Goliath's amber eyes followed him until he disappeared into the darkness. The great horse remained at the gate for a long time, a black silhouette against the star-filled Montana sky. Keeping watch over the kingdom of healing he had built with nothing more than patience, wisdom, and an inexhaustible capacity for love. The seasons continued their ancient rhythm over the recovery ranch. Spring turned to summer, summer to fall, and with each passing year, Goliath's legacy grew deeper and more profound. But it wasn't just about the numbers or the success stories anymore. It was about something that couldn't be measured in statistics or documented in case files. It was about the quiet revolution happening in the hearts of everyone who encountered the magnificent black horse. Dylan often thought about that morning in the forest. About the chains. About the note that said Goliath was too much trouble. About how close the world had come to losing something irreplaceable. In his darker moments, he would lie awake wondering how many other Goliaths were out there, chained to their own trees, waiting for someone brave enough to set them free. One autumn afternoon, a woman arrived at the ranch driving a car with out-of-state plates. She was probably in her late 40s, dressed in expensive clothes that seemed out of place against the rustic backdrop of the Montana ranch. She stood by the fence for a long time, just watching Goliath work with a group of children in the therapy arena. Dylan approached her cautiously. "Can I help you with something?" The woman didn't look at him. Her eyes remained fixed on Goliath. "I'm the one who left him there," she said quietly. "Chained to that tree." Dylan felt his breath catch in his chest. For 5 years, he'd wondered about the person who had written that note. The person who had abandoned Goliath to die. He'd imagined confronting them countless times, demanding to know how anyone could do something so cruel. But standing there beside her, watching tears stream down her face as she looked at the horse she'd given up on, Dylan felt something unexpected. Not anger. Not judgment. Just profound sadness for what she'd lost. "His name was actually Titan back then," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "He was my husband's horse. My husband died suddenly, and I inherited everything, including a horse I had no idea how to care for. I tried. God, I tried. But I was drowning in grief and debt, and Titan was so big, so powerful. I was terrified of him. Terrified I'd do something wrong and he'd get hurt. or hurt someone else. She wiped at her eyes with shaking hands. I told myself I was leaving him where someone would find him, that I was giving him a chance. But the truth is, I was just too much of a coward to face what I was really doing. I've lived with that guilt every single day since. Dylan let the silence stretch between them. Goliath had noticed the woman and was walking toward the fence with that uncanny awareness he always seemed to have when someone was in pain. "Why did you come here?" Dylan asked gently. "I saw the article about the recovery ranch. Saw the picture of Goliath. I knew it was him immediately. Those eyes, they're unmistakable. I had to see for myself that he was really okay. That he'd actually survived my cowardice." Goliath reached the fence and extended his head toward the woman. She flinched back initially, but the horse waited patiently, his amber eyes locked on hers with that same penetrating gaze that had first captured Dylan's heart. Very slowly, the woman reached out and touched Goliath's nose. The horse stood perfectly still, allowing the connection. "I'm so sorry," she whispered to him. "I'm so sorry." What happened next was something Dylan would remember for the rest of his life. Goliath pressed his forehead gently against the woman's chest, right over her heart. She wrapped her arms around his massive head and sobbed. Deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to come from a place of pain she'd been carrying for 5 long years. They stood that way for several minutes. Woman and horse. Grief and forgiveness. Past and present meeting in a moment of profound grace. When she finally pulled back, the woman's face looked different. Lighter somehow, as if a crushing weight had been lifted from her shoulders. "He forgives you," Dylan said softly. "Maybe it's time you forgave yourself." The woman nodded, unable to speak. She stayed at the ranch for the rest of the afternoon, watching Goliath work. Before she left, she made a substantial donation to the program and asked if she could volunteer remotely, helping with fundraising and outreach. "I can't undo what I did," she told Dylan as she prepared to leave. "But maybe I can help make sure other horses, other broken things, get the second chances they deserve." After she drove away, Dylan stood with Goliath in the gathering dusk. "You're teaching all of us, aren't you, boy? Teaching us that healing isn't just for the people who come here. It's for everyone. Even the ones who caused the pain in the first place." Goliath nickered softly, and Dylan felt that familiar warmth spread through his chest. The warmth that came from being part of something greater than himself. Something that was changing the world one wounded heart at a time. The years continued to unfold. The recovery ranch expanded to include additional programs, residential retreats for veterans with PTSD, summer camps for children with special needs, grief counseling sessions for families who had lost loved ones. Through it all, Goliath remained the heart and soul of the operation. He was 12 years old now, in the prime of his life, still powerful and magnificent. But Dylan had started to notice small changes. The way Goliath would sometimes pause in the middle of the pasture, as if listening to something only he could hear. The way his amber eyes would grow distant, contemplative. Dr. Vance assured Dylan that Goliath was in perfect health. "He's just getting wiser," she said with a smile. "If that's even possible." On a crisp October morning, exactly 7 years after Dylan had found Goliath chained to that tree, Dylan woke with an inexplicable sense of urgency. He threw on his clothes and hurried to the barn, his heart pounding for no reason he could name. Goliath was standing at his usual spot by the gate, but something was different. The great horse was looking toward the forest, toward the place where his story had begun. When he turned to look at Dylan, his amber eyes held an expression that Dylan had never seen before. Peaceful, knowing, complete. "What is it, boy?" Dylan asked, approaching slowly. "What are you trying to tell me?" Goliath walked to Dylan and rested his massive head on Dylan's shoulder. They stood that way for a long time, man and horse, breathing in rhythm, connected by a bond that transcended words or logic or anything that could be explained by science or reason. Finally, Goliath pulled back and began walking toward the forest trail. Dylan followed without question, the way he'd followed 7 years ago when Goliath had first led him on an unexpected journey. They walked through the autumn woods, leaves crunching beneath their feet and hooves. The morning sun filtered through the trees, painting everything in shades of gold. When they reached the clearing with the ancient oak tree, Goliath stopped. The chains were long gone, cleared away years ago. But the tree remained, a silent witness to what had happened in this place. To the cruelty and the redemption. To the ending that had become a beginning. Goliath stood beside the tree for a long moment, as if paying respect to his own past. Then he turned to Dylan, and in that gaze, Dylan understood. This wasn't goodbye. This was acknowledgement. A recognition of the journey they'd taken together. From this place of chains and death to a life of purpose and healing. From brokenness to wholeness. From despair to hope. I understand, Dylan whispered, even though he wasn't entirely sure he did. Thank you for choosing me. Thank you for teaching me what it means to heal. What it means to forgive. What it means to love without conditions or limits. They walked back to the ranch together as the sun climbed higher in the sky. When they emerged from the forest, Dylan saw that the first families of the day were already arriving. Children were laughing. Parents were smiling. Another day of healing was about to begin. Goliath moved toward the therapy arena with renewed purpose, ready to work his magic once again. But he paused at the gate and looked back at Dylan one more time, those amber eyes holding a message that Dylan would spend the rest of his life trying to fully comprehend. Some creatures are born to teach us what we most need to learn. Some arrive in chains so we can discover what true freedom means. Some come into our lives broken so we can understand that healing is always possible, no matter how deep the wounds or how heavy the chains or how dark the past. Dylan stood watching as Goliath greeted the first child of the day, a little boy who had stopped speaking after witnessing violence in his home. The boy's face lit up when he saw Goliath. The great horse lowered his head to the child's level, and Dylan saw the beginning of another miracle unfolding before his eyes. This was Goliath's gift. This was his purpose. And somehow, miraculously, Dylan had been chosen to witness it, to facilitate it, to be forever changed by it. Benjamin Whitmore appeared beside Dylan, moving slower now at 79 but still sharp as ever. The old rancher watched Goliath and the boy in comfortable silence before speaking. "You know what I think about when I see that horse?" Benjamin said. "I think about all the times I almost gave up on this ranch. All the times I thought it was too much trouble, too much work, too much of a losing battle. Then you showed up. And then Goliath showed up. And suddenly this old place that was dying became the most important piece of land in the entire state. Maybe in the whole country." Dylan smiled. "Goliath did that. Not me. No, son. You both did it. That's the point. Healing isn't a solo act. It takes someone willing to remove the chains and someone willing to trust again after the chains are gone. It takes both of you, working together, to make miracles happen." As the morning unfolded and more families arrived, Dylan moved through his routines with the practiced ease of someone who had found his true calling. He coordinated therapy sessions. He talked with parents. He supervised volunteers. He made sure every person who came to the ranch felt welcomed and understood and hopeful. But his eyes always returned to Goliath. To the magnificent black horse who had taught an entire community what redemption looked like. Who had shown them that the most broken among us often have the greatest capacity for healing others. Who had proven beyond any doubt that love, patience, and second chances could transform literally everything. Years from now, long after Goliath's time on Earth was done, his legacy would continue. The ranch would keep growing. More horses would be rescued and trained. More people would find healing in this unexpected sanctuary tucked away in the Montana wilderness. But there would never be another Goliath. There would never be another horse who could look into a person's soul and know exactly what they needed. Who could forgive the unforgivable. Who could turn chains into freedom and abandonment into purpose and death into everlasting life. That evening, as Dylan did his final rounds, Goliath was waiting at their spot by the pasture gate. The autumn stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Dylan wrapped his arms around Goliath's neck one more time, breathing in the familiar scent of horse and hay and home. "We did good today, didn't we, boy?" Dylan whispered. Goliath blew softly through his nostrils, his sound of contentment, of peace, of yes. They stood together in the gathering darkness, just as they had 7 years ago when their journey together had begun. Two souls who had saved each other. Two lives that had been transformed by a single act of compassion in a forest clearing on a cold October morning. The chains were gone. The wounds had healed. The scared, starving horse had become a legend. The broken, lost man had become a healer. And love, patient, unconditional, transformative love, had made it all possible. This incredible journey of Goliath and Dylan proves that sometimes we find our purpose in the most unexpected places, often when we're simply brave enough to act with compassion when others turn away. If this story has moved you, please take a moment to share it with someone who needs to be reminded that healing is always possible, that second chances are real, and that even the heaviest chains can be broken. Hit that like button if you believe in the power of redemption, and subscribe for more stories that celebrate the unbreakable bond between humans and the animals who change our lives forever. Let us know in the comments what moment from Goliath's story touched you most deeply. Your support helps us continue sharing these powerful reminders that love, in its purest form, can transform everything it touches. Thank you for being part of this incredible community of believers in second chances and unexpected miracles.